Now we would like to invite upon Mr. PVG Menon, Advisor ESDM, Co-founder Texas Foundation and past President of ESS, CI and IESA.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me put a disclaimer. I got a call at 6:30 in the morning yesterday. I'm substituting for Mr. Gururaj. But then I was very lucky. 2 months ago, I gave a keynote. That was a 1-hour keynote in Delhi on the way forward for electronics. And I could take elements of that and go back to an article I wrote for BangaloreIT.com on ESDM and the way ahead for Karnataka, and try and map with what is in the report, which I had a very quick look. And without further ado, I was told I have 10 minutes. I may exceed slightly, so I'll crave your indulgence for that. Let me just contextualize. This sector is a very large sector. It's $1 trillion globally, electronics, out of which about $530 billion is the current semiconductor consumption in the world. Out of that whole thing, we are about 200 billion. Now, for those of you who don't know ESDM, I must confess I use this word at least 10 times in a day. So ESDM is Electronic System Design and Manufacturing, consists of 5 things. First is electronic products, the ubiquitous smartphone, but computers, televisions, set-top boxes, all the products that you can touch and feel. Semiconductors, I like to say that this little piece of silicon is what converts your electronic device into something a little more intelligent and a little more useful than a very expensive paperweight. Components, this is printed circuit boards, connectors, wiring harnesses. This is quite large, by the way. That's another about $35–40 billion. Design services, out of the about 125 global semiconductor companies in the world, at least 120 of them have a presence in India. And probably 95% of those have a presence in Bangalore. So I often say that there is probably no chip in the world which is not touched by India and very likely not touched by Bangalore in some way or the other. Design services, this is again about $35 billion. VLSI design, embedded software. Sorry. A fair amount of printed circuit board design that happens quite a bit in Karnataka, but also there are new centers coming up. Coimbatore has emerged as a big center for PCB, things like that. And exports. We did about $15 billion worth of exports. And those of you who follow Twitter, despite the overwhelming noise on Twitter about smartphone exports, it's only $1 billion out of that 15. A lot of the electronics exports is tied to our foreign policy, so OECD countries, OAU, Afghanistan, and some of the policy implementations that some of the groups have been involved with have been directed towards telling the government of India that let's try and push real make in India, not assembled in India. So coming back, the sector is approximately 3.5% of India's GDP. And as per this McKinsey FICCI report, 7% of Karnataka's GSDP on target to go to 11%. So the sector is important. And the current paradigm of contract manufacturing means that we have all India basis almost approaching 1 million people who have employment in this sector. So the higher order in terms of design is, it's a thinner part of the pyramid, but at the base, at the bottom end where we have contract manufacturing, Wistron next to Bangalore and Kolar already employs about 15,000 people, and I've seen press reportage that it'll go to 25,000. Foxconn is already at about 35,000, and they've announced they'll go to 100,000 with the new investments that are coming in. There is a problem in this sector, and the problem is that if you look at our domestic manufacturing, which is approximately $90 billion of products that are manufactured in India, more likely assembled in India, our domestic value addition is abysmal. It's about 20%. When we in the India Electronics and Semiconductor Association first did a consumption study in 2006, our domestic value addition was around 30%, and that has come down. And this is not the forum, but some of the other associations I've been involved with have actually written to the government saying that the famous production-linked incentive needs to be tweaked to tie incentivization to local sourcing. And if you incentivize only production, then the current paradigm where we have $4 of imports for $1 of exports, and as the Economic Times said early last year, our electronics imports have gone up by 6x after PLI kicked in. So I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but today electronic imports is the second highest contributor to the current account deficit of India. Till a year and a half ago, it was gold. Petroleum, gold, electronics. 18 months ago, electronics jumped. There are doomsday scenarios which talk about electronics overtaking petroleum, but given our insatiable appetite for buying cars and our population, that seems unlikely. But having said that, the demographic dividend means that our demand for electronics is also insatiable. Every young person who gets a job, the first salary, trust me, the first thing they buy is a smartphone. The second thing they buy is either a computer or a tablet. So sometimes the demographic dividend cuts the other way as well. Okay, Karnataka, quick snapshot. We are the ESDM leader. One thing that has worked to Bangalore's advantage has been the fact that we've had a very strong engineering base here. Started with the defense labs around the city, and they seeded a lot of the early software and electronics companies that came in. I remember when I was working in, it was still called Philips Semiconductors in those days, in the mid-90s, I think about 45% of our design engineers were from either DRDO or ISRO. And of course, the Indian Institute of Science has been a flag bearer. Today, the Center for Nanoscience and Engineering has a fab here. We have IIIT Bangalore, which has a very decent school for VLSI design. NIT Surathkal is also a pretty strong school for design and system engineering. Now, I apologize here. My view of some of these clusters is very Delhi-centric before I relocated last year. But I have had some involvement with the Mysore cluster very early, 10 years ago when I was running IESA, when we had a discussion on the Greenfield cluster in Mysore, and later when we intervened there from the skill development perspective at the Lahiri cluster. Mysore is a phenomenal cluster in terms of the kind of expertise that has been built in. And a little further down, Nanjangud is India's largest printed circuit board company. So Mysore is a pretty good cluster for electronics manufacturing. We have a lot of mid-sized units and some very small units in and around Bangalore, Mysore. And of course, there's a big one big one, which is Wistron in Kolar for electronics manufacturing. Belgaum and Hubli emerging. Hubli is a very interesting place from the innovation standpoint with the Deshpande Foundation's incubator. And Belgaum, of course, ACUS has been doing a lot of work in avionics. And and those are areas that could be leveraged. One thing I want to call out specifically is the Karnataka government has been very, very proactive. I remember the time 10 years ago when I was interacting with Mr. Vidyashankar when he was in government. Not many people are aware. I think the very first incubator in the country was actually established in Bangalore with the help of the Karnataka government and NASSCOM. And then IESA got the first fabless incubator company, the entity here with support of the Karnataka government. That's the Safal incubator. I've seen that the McKinsey report talks about COEs to be set up as accelerator networks. At the IESA, we set up a couple of these accelerators. We did the first one in Delhi. That model has propagated around the country. And there is, of course, India's largest ESDM incubator, the Maker Village in Cochin. And I think it would be safe to say the jury is still out on how successful they have been. And I think there are learnings from the Bangalore model, how the NASSCOM startup warehouse ran, which, even as these new network accelerators are set up, I think those learnings have to be looked at because a templated model is not going to work. And coming back on the state thing, it is competitive federalism. I think Dr. Manjunath talked about the way Telangana is moving ahead. So is Odisha. So Tamil Nadu is coming back. Gujarat is moving on manufacturing. So there's going to be a lot of stuff. Now, the way ahead, I'll make it brief. I can spend an hour on this. One, I am, having been involved in trying to build a $10 billion display fab in Maharashtra and going through that exercise for about 3 years, I am no longer convinced that large capex, extremely polluting semiconductor manufacturing plants are the way ahead. I think we need to look at this a little more critically. And I wrote an article last month, which is published in the Advanced Computing and Communication Society Journal, where I said semiconductors represents the confluence of geopolitics, innovation, capital, and technology. And if you look at the geopolitical scenario today, I think there are other options to securing your silicon supply chain. Just to give you an idea of what we are talking about, 40,000 wafer starts a month, 300 millimeter CMOS fab will require about 25 million liters of ultra-pure water a day. 60,000 sheet display fab will require about 20 million liters of water a day. Even if you bring in the latest technology, you're looking at water recycling of about 75–80%. And the effluent is so polluted that after about 13–14 stages of purification, it can only be evaporated. It cannot be put back to recharge the groundwater. So on a lighter note, every fab usually has a water body, and we put in a few ducts and other things, and our corporate communications guys go overboard saying how responsible we are from an environmental perspective. Nonsense. We just have to make the water evaporate. So, but coming back, there's also a tremendous amount of power that is required, clean power. There is a McKinsey report which says that a standard small fab, and a small fab is 30–40,000 wafer starts a month, will require enough power to light up 50,000 homes for a year. And this is clean power. So there can't be variations, things like that. So from a sustainability point of view alone, fabs are, one needs to relook at it. Second, from a fiscal point of view, the biggest fab in the world is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC. I don't know how many of you are aware that the Taiwan government gave them fiscal support for 17 years before they broke even. Singapore had Chartered Semiconductors, which got taken over by Global Foundries, funded by EDB. 10 years later, they sold it to Global Foundries. It wasn't breaking even. So fabs need large amounts of capex, large amounts of opex. Technological obsolescence means that you will do a process upgrade practically every 2 years. And finally, they don't generate all that much of employment. One of the previous speakers was talking about the Japanese model of a computer, a man, and a dog. The core fab is probably going to require 500 people. They're all going to be expats. We don't have that expertise here. Then you look at the other ecosystems, HVAC, supply chain, so on and so forth. You will probably get a little more employment there. But it's not the amount, per 1 crore spent, what you would get for, say, textile, you're not going to get that kind of employment numbers here. It is of strategic importance. So let me put it very bluntly. The government of India would like to see a fab happen. But the state government, when it gives incentivization which is matching the central incentive schemes, the state government may not really get the payback that it needs for that dollar spent. So food for thought. And I'll just end by saying, in the current geopolitical situation, post-COVID, all the hysterical investment numbers that have happened in the United States, in Taiwan, in Europe, in South Korea and Japan, possibly there are other models to look at for securing our supply chain. So I'll stop that on the fabs. Now, what is the way forward for Karnataka? I think number one, we need to focus on leveraging our proven strengths. Our software industry has proven that innovation, R&D, and IPR, we can do something. So what is the way forward? Can we build products out of India? In other words, can we get a Samsung and an Apple out of India, and as I like to say, made in Karnataka for the world? Because, ladies and gentlemen, please note, courtesy ITA 1, which India signed in 1997 and came into effect in 2000, a lot of the products that are made anywhere in the world are available in India, duty-free. So the competition is not going to be a smartphone made in Noida or a smartphone made in Tirupati or a smartphone made in Sri City. The competition is going to be a smartphone made in Vietnam or China or designed in Silicon Valley. Second, we need to create those independent design houses which can do design of products which can be used by multiple brands. Some of you may remember we used to have brands called Micromax and Carbon. And they all went and bought their handset designs from one company called BBK in China. BBK owns 4 brands: Vivo, Oppo, Xiaomi, Redmi, Realme. When demand hockey sticked, the guys in China said, why are we sitting around here letting these guys make money? Why don't we go in and make money ourselves? And India had put in the 10% BCD on import of smartphones. And so today, 67% of the smartphone market in India is owned by the Chinese, as per the latest Counterpoint report. So can we have those independent design houses? Now we have, I'm going to take a name here, some of you may know this, there's a company called Scanray in Mysore, which is amazing. The way during COVID they scaled up their, the respirator, the oxygen concentrators and all of that. And they scaled it, and then they did the contract manufacturing. I think BEL made it, a whole bunch of other people went out and made it. So can we have 100 such Scanrays? Way back in 2013-14, the ISA set out a goal. Can we have, in 10 years, 50 fabless semiconductor companies out of India and 100 product companies out of India? In other words, can we have 50 companies like Qualcomm and MediaTek and 100 companies like Apple and Samsung? Lots of things have to play together. Now, some of the things I like about Karnataka, the Make in India is now, for government procurement, is part of the state policy. Why is government procurement important? There's an OECD report which says in developing countries, 33% of total demand is from government, center, state, PSUs, state PSUs, central PSUs, all of that. Now, if we can aggregate that and say that, for example, categories of products, there will be a minimum baseline of 50% domestic sourcing, and we can easily catch that using the GST filings of companies. Unless that happens, we are not going to buy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a $90 billion market going to $130 billion. If you set aside 50% of that, that is enough demand to set up an Apple or a Samsung out of India. It's not going to happen on its own. Supply chains are hard to reorient. And after COVID, I wrote an article. I said, let's not waste this crisis. Unfortunately, we did. So anyway, so can we build those IDHs out of India? I'm glad the policy talks about setting up 100 embedded independent design houses. Easier said than done. Attempts have been made by the central government, but we have to take it forward. Second, everyone's talking about supporting MSMEs. It's hard because they need upgrades on skill, on technology, and fiscal support. Yeah. And if we can make that happen, I think previous speakers have talked about employment and value addition from MSMEs. And let's not forget, MSMEs do value addition in India because they don't have the clout of a Foxconn or a Flextronics to go and do global sourcing. So that's what I wanted to sort of cover in the time I had. I've just got a note that I'm out of time. So anyone interested in taking this forward, I'm around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Menon. Now we